Some stories aren't meant to be whispered. They're meant to be felt, deeply, viscerally, because sometimes a single moment, a single gesture, has the power to undo everything we thought we knew about love, pride, and the quiet dignity of giving. What happened that night in Paris wasn't just a dinner, it was a turning point in the way I saw my grandfather and the way I saw the world. If you've ever questioned the weight of kindness or the value of a soul untouched by wealth, then stay with me. This story isn't perfect, but it's real, and I promise you, by the end, you won't see the streets the same way again. Enjoy the story. The air was thick with perfume and roasted garlic as we stepped through the velvet-draped entrance of La Maison de l'Or, one of Paris's most revered restaurants tucked away behind wrought iron gates and ivy-covered walls. I had never been inside a place like that before, not even with my grandfather, who always preferred luxury, but often kept our outings more discreet. But tonight was different. He wore his finest dark gray suit, the kind tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been sewn onto his skin. His gold cufflinks shimmered each time his hand moved, and the silver-tipped cane, a family heirloom he often said, clicked rhythmically against the marble floor as he walked. I followed behind, nervous, curious, wondering why tonight of all nights he chose to bring me here. We passed crystal chandeliers, quiet tables lit by candlelight, and walls lined with black and white portraits of forgotten aristocrats who once ruled the very streets we'd just walked. It was elegance at its peak, a kind of old money sophistication that didn't need to prove itself. My grandfather always believed that money wasn't for flaunting. It was for wielding, quietly, strategically. He tipped the maitre d' with a nod rather than a bill. The man bowed with practiced grace and guided us to a table by the window, overlooking the boulevard where Paris sparkled like a jewelry box spilled open. Across the street, the Seine flowed in quiet rhythm, reflecting the light of passing cars and distant cafes. I took my seat and tried to look composed, but he noticed. He always did. "Nervous?" he asked without looking at me, unfolding his napkin with the precision of a surgeon. I nodded. "Just overwhelmed," I whispered. He smiled faintly, the way he did when people failed to meet his expectations, or when they surprised him. I never knew which it was until later. The waiter arrived, and before I could say a word, my grandfather ordered in flawless French, escargots for him, filet mignon for me, and a 1995 Chateau Margaux. It was clear, this wasn't a dinner. This was a lesson. As the waiter disappeared into the hushed elegance of the restaurant, my grandfather leaned back in his chair and began tapping his fingers softly against the white tablecloth. A habit I had come to recognize as the prelude to a story or a sermon. He didn't waste words. Every sentence he spoke carried weight, as if each syllable was calculated to leave an impression. "You see that man over there?" he said, gesturing subtly toward a balding gentleman in a burgundy blazer, seated 3 tables away with a woman too young and too disinterested to be his wife. Inherited millions. But he's bankrupt where it counts. I followed his gaze, confused. "Where it counts?" I asked. He looked at me, expressionless. "Character, backbone. He's rich in paper, poor in soul." And just like that, he was back to sipping his wine as if his judgment had already been sealed. That was my grandfather, a man whose morality came wrapped in irony and cashmere. He judged harshly but lived by the codes he carved for himself. I admired him, even feared him a little. But most of all, I wanted to understand him. It wasn't long before the food arrived, carried on silver trays by men who moved like shadows. The smells were intoxicating. The garlic butter from the escargots, the seared perfection of the filet. My stomach growled, but my mind was still spinning from his words. What made someone truly rich? Was it taste, class, wisdom? Or was it power? The ability to sit in a place like this and make the world bend to your presence without raising your voice? My grandfather cut into his dish without ceremony. "Eat," he commanded, and I obeyed. We ate in silence for a while, the only sounds around us the clink of forks against porcelain and the gentle murmurs of other conversations. Then, just as I lifted my glass, I noticed something outside the window. A shadow. A small figure. Pressed against the glass like a forgotten ghost. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The kind of moment your eyes invent when the world feels too perfect. But then I saw her clearly. A girl. No older than 10. Her cheeks hollow. Her eyes wide and locked on the plates before us. Her dress was torn, hanging like loose paper over her thin frame. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of a coat too big for her, or perhaps not hers at all. She didn't move. She just watched as if trying to absorb the scent of the food through the thick pane of glass. I froze. My fork stopped mid-air. My grandfather noticed, followed my gaze, and then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't look away. He stared at the girl for a long moment, not with pity, not with discomfort, but with something far more complex. A stillness fell between us, the kind that makes the world outside feel like it's been put on pause. And then, with unnerving calm, he set down his silverware, wiped the corner of his mouth, and motioned for the waiter. "Bring her in," he said quietly without a hint of drama. The waiter blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Monsieur?" My grandfather didn't repeat himself. He simply held his gaze, and the waiter, recognizing that this was a man who did not like to be questioned, bowed and walked briskly toward the entrance. I sat frozen in my chair, not knowing what to say. Was this a test? Was he about to humiliate her? Or worse, teach me some cold lesson about charity and power? Minutes passed in a slow, painful crawl. Then the door opened, and in came the girl. She looked even smaller up close. Dirt smudged her forehead, and her knees were scraped beneath. Torn stockings, but her eyes, those enormous haunted eyes, never left our table. She didn't look scared. She looked hungry, not just for food, but for warmth, for something human. The waiter stood beside her, unsure of what to do next, until my grandfather gave a nod. "Seat her," he said. "Here, next to me." The maître d' flinched, but obeyed, pulling a chair out with hesitant hands and placing a napkin in her lap like she was royalty. And for a moment, the entire restaurant fell into stunned silence. Heads turned. Silverware paused mid-air. People whispered, confused, appalled, fascinated. A poor girl, filthy and trembling, seated among silks and pearls and polished gold. Paris had seen revolutions. But this was something else. My grandfather looked around the room, meeting every stare with indifference. "Let them watch," he muttered. "They've forgotten what hunger looks like." Then, turning to the girl, he did something I never thought I'd see from him. He smiled, gently, warmly. "What's your name?" he asked. Her lips parted, dry and uncertain. "Elise," she whispered. He nodded. "Elise," he repeated, like it mattered. Then he gestured to the waiter. "Bring her anything she wants, and double it." The man rushed off, and the girl, Elise, stared at him like he had just spoken a language she'd never heard before. I looked at my grandfather, stunned. This man, who had once refused to give a beggar a single coin because mercy without dignity is cruelty, was now feeding a starving girl in one of the richest restaurants in Paris. And he wasn't doing it for show. He wasn't even doing it for me. He was doing it for her. The plates arrived within minutes, steaming and immaculate, as if the chefs themselves had sensed the urgency in her silence. The waiter placed the dishes in front of Elise with trembling hands. Roasted chicken glazed in honey and thyme, a side of creamy dauphinoise potatoes, and a small bowl of golden soup that shimmered like the chandeliers above. She looked at it as though it were a mirage. Her eyes darted between the food and my grandfather, waiting, not for permission, but for confirmation that this wasn't a cruel trick. My grandfather leaned slightly toward her, eyes firm but soft. "Eat, child," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "And don't apologize for it." That was when something cracked inside me. I realized I wasn't watching an act of generosity. I was watching a man revisit a version of himself that maybe, just maybe, he had buried long ago. She ate slowly at first, cautiously, as though she expected someone to snatch the plate away. But with each bite, her hands steadied, her breathing slowed, and the shadows in her eyes softened just a little. The restaurant around us continued, in uneasy silence. No one dared say a word, but the discomfort was thick in the air, like smoke. A couple to our right shifted in their seats. A woman nearby raised an eyebrow, clearly offended by the disruption of her curated evening. I saw judgment crawling across faces, whispers disguised as sips of wine, disgust masked behind half-hearted smiles. And yet, my grandfather remained, undisturbed. He watched Elise eat the way one watches a sunrise after a long, stormy night, not in awe of the spectacle, but in reverence of its quiet truth. I couldn't stop staring at him. This man who had taught me that success was about discipline, appearances, legacy, was now breaking every social rule he had ever enforced. "Why are you doing this?" I asked him under my breath, afraid to interrupt the fragile peace that had settled between them. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Because I once watched my mother beg for bread," he said. "And someone turned their back." My heart jolted. He never spoke of his childhood. It was as if his life began with his first paycheck. But now a fragment of the boy he used to be had slipped through the cracks in his marble exterior. And for the first time, I realized that the man I had idolized wasn't sculpted from stone. He was stitched together by scars. He glanced at Elise, who was finishing her soup with delicate sips, and then turned back to me. "Kindness," he said, "is only real when it costs you something." He didn't say it like a quote. He said it like a confession. And suddenly, the chandeliers above us didn't seem so bright, the violins so loud. The entire restaurant, the elegance, the decor, the pageantry, faded into the background. All that remained was a girl with food in her belly, a man with ghosts in his eyes, and me, caught between them, forever changed. As Elise finished the last bite of her meal, she looked up, not at my grandfather, but at me. There was no smile on her face, no grand gesture of thanks, just a long, searching gaze that pierced through layers of privilege I didn't even know I had. Her eyes were not pleading, they were not grateful, they were dignified. It was as if she knew that, tonight, her hunger had granted her access to a table not meant for her, but she refused to be ashamed of it. My grandfather noticed too. "That's the difference between surviving and begging," he muttered, almost to himself. "One takes courage, the other takes despair." The words hovered in the air, heavy like smoke. I didn't know what to say. I had seen countless people on the streets before, brushed past them, tossed coins into open palms without ever looking back. But never once had I invited them to sit. Never once had I imagined they could look back at me as an equal. The waiter returned with a dessert cart, his hands visibly shaking. I could see the conflict in his eyes, torn between duty and discomfort. My grandfather, unbothered, gestured toward Elise. "Let her choose." The man nodded and turned the cart toward her. She looked at the display, tarts, chocolate mousse, creme brulee, then pointed at a simple strawberry eclair, the smallest and humblest dessert on the tray. "Good choice," my grandfather said, as if she had passed another invisible test. "It doesn't need to be extravagant to be perfect." The waiter served it with a silver fork, and Elise took her time, savoring each bite. I watched her fingers curl around the plate, not to protect it, but to anchor herself to the moment. She was no longer just feeding her body. She was holding onto the first taste of safety she might have had in years. Then something strange happened. One by one, the whispers in the restaurant began to die down. The discomfort turned into reluctant admiration. I saw a man across the room nod slowly. A woman clutched her husband's hand. The transformation wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. The presence of a starving child at a table of wealth didn't ruin the atmosphere. It humbled it. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part for the diners, to be reminded that kindness, when done right, doesn't beg for applause. It simply shifts the room without a single sound. My grandfather glanced around, satisfied. "You see," he said, "people think generosity is about money. It's not. It's about permission. And tonight, I gave them all permission to feel. As Elise finished her eclair, my grandfather gently placed his napkin on the table. "Time to go," he said. The girl's eyes widened, not in fear, but in hesitation. She wasn't ready to leave the warmth, the music, the fleeting taste of belonging. My grandfather stood, extended his hand, and she took it. Slowly, carefully. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Thick, sealed, and clearly full of more than paper. He tucked it into her coat pocket without a word, not a speech, not a single explanation, just a quiet gesture. Then he looked at her and said, "Don't sell your soul for bread, Elise. Let this buy you time to dream." She stared at him, stunned. No tears, just silence. A sacred, unbreakable silence. Outside, the night had grown colder, and the wind carried with it that particular bite only Paris could conjure after sundown. The kind of wind that makes you wrap your coat a little tighter, walk a little faster, and forget the poetry of the city in favor of warmth. But Elise didn't flinch. She walked beside my grandfather, her thin shoes clicking unevenly on the cobblestones, her small hand still wrapped in his. I followed a few steps behind, unsure of where we were going. We passed shuttered bakeries and flower stalls left with only wilted stems, the glow of the Eiffel Tower shimmering faintly in the distance. For a brief moment, it felt like we were the only three people in the city. A strange, silent procession moving through wealth, poverty, and something far deeper in between. Finally, we reached the edge of a narrow alleyway, one I had never noticed before despite walking this route many times. My grandfather stopped, turned to Elise, and knelt down. Something I had never seen him do for anyone, not even me. "This is where you leave us," he said gently, his voice low and careful, like he was afraid any loud word might scare the night away. "But before you do, I want you to promise me something." Elise looked up, her expression unreadable. "Promise me you'll find a way to rise. Not because of what I gave you tonight, but because of what you've survived without it." The girl said nothing, but she nodded once, firm, deliberate, as if swearing an oath to the universe itself. He stood, adjusted the scarf around his neck, and gave her one final look. A look that said more than goodbye. A look that carried regret, pride, grief, and something dangerously close to love. Then he turned and walked past me without a word. I looked back. Elise had already disappeared into the shadows of the alley, the envelope pressed tightly to her chest. I wanted to follow her, to ask her where she would sleep, if she'd be safe, if she even believed in hope anymore. But something in my grandfather's silence told me not to. Some doors are meant to close gently, not with answers, but with faith. We walked the rest of the way in silence. No lecture, no summary of the lesson. Just footsteps echoing between the stone buildings and the occasional flicker of street lamps catching the edge of his cane. I kept waiting for him to explain what had just happened, to package it neatly, the way he did with everything in life. But when we reached the hotel and the doorman tipped his hat and opened the grand glass doors for us, all he said was, "This. There are moments that change men. Tonight wasn't for her, it was for me." Then he disappeared into the elevator, leaving me standing in the lobby, stunned by the weight of a story that hadn't even finished unfolding. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared out of the window, watching the city breathe beneath me. Somewhere out there, a little girl was clutching hope in her hands. And somewhere inside this luxurious suite, a man who ruled boardrooms and banks had let himself be vulnerable for the first time in decades. Maybe the world hadn't changed, but I had, and I knew without question that I would never forget. The sound of silverware pausing, of breath held in luxury, of a stranger's hunger breaking through a wall of glass. Because that was the night I learned. Real wealth is not measured in euros, or wine, or gold, but in how gently you respond when the world dares to ask for mercy. The next morning, Paris wore a different face. The sky was pale, brushed with strokes of morning gray, and the city moved with that quiet urgency that only locals seem to understand. the kind that didn't stop for beauty because it had long grown used to it. I met my grandfather downstairs in the hotel's breakfast salon. He was already seated, as always, impeccably dressed, with a newspaper folded neatly beside his plate and a glass of orange juice left untouched. He didn't greet me with a smile or a nod, just a glance that lingered for half a second too long, like he was still somewhere else. I sat down across from him, unsure of what to say. Part of me thought last night had been a dream, a strange, poetic hallucination born of candlelight and emotion. But then I saw it. His cane, resting beside the chair, had a small chip on its silver handle. It hadn't been there before. He had knelt for Elise. That much was real. Without lifting his gaze, he began to speak. "Do you remember what I said about permission?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." He folded the napkin on his lap, perfectly aligned with the table's edge. "Most people never give themselves permission to feel uncomfortable, to break the frame, to admit they've forgotten how to be human." He looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw something raw in his eyes. But discomfort is where the soul breathes again. His voice cracked slightly, barely perceptible, but I noticed. And it was in that fracture that I realized something powerful. Even the strongest men are haunted, not by weakness, but by the moments they chose silence when they should have chosen softness. I asked him if he had known her, if Elise was someone from his past, a granddaughter of a friend, a distant relative, anything. He shook his head. No, she was no one to me. But last night, I saw my mother's hunger in her eyes, and I saw my own face in yours. I sat back, stunned. "My face?" He nodded. "You froze, not out of fear but shame. You recognized something and didn't know what to do with it. That's what growing up feels like, boy. It's not when you learn how to win. It's when you learn how to witness." I felt my throat tighten. There it was again. The way. He turned pain into philosophy, suffering into scripture. But last night had been more than metaphor. It was a rupture, a quiet rebellion against the comfort we had always worn like armor. After breakfast, we checked out of the hotel. The concierge asked if everything had been satisfactory. My grandfather smiled politely, as always. But I noticed he left an envelope behind at the front desk. A different one this time, slimmer, lighter, but handwritten with care. I didn't ask what was inside. I didn't need to. There was a rhythm to his generosity now, something deliberate and unspoken. It wasn't about guilt. It was about restoration, about returning something to a world that had taken too much. As we stepped into the black car waiting outside, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a question, one that would follow me for years. When it's your turn to be the one seated inside, will you open your hand? Or will you close the curtain? The ride to the airport was quiet, wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't demand conversation, only reflection. Paris drifted past our window like a dream slowly fading into daylight. Cafes opened their shutters, bakers stacked loaves of fresh bread behind foggy glass, and children in navy uniforms rushed down cobbled sidewalks with oversized backpacks. Life continued. It always does. But inside that car, something felt permanently altered. My grandfather rested his hands on the silver lionhead cane, staring straight ahead, his eyes unfocused. I knew he wasn't seeing the streets. He was replaying something, or someone, and I didn't interrupt him. I couldn't, because part of me had finally grasped that some things, the deepest truths, the quietest wounds, don't belong in words. They live in the spaces between them. He finally spoke just as we passed the Seine. "Most people believe the poor are invisible," he said, "but the truth is, we train ourselves not to see them." His voice was soft, but each syllable landed with force. And after a while, we stopped seeing anything that threatens the story we built about ourselves. I looked at him, unsure if he was talking to me, or himself. Maybe both. He turned to me, eyes steady. Don't let your wealth become your blindness. That single line, so measured, so deliberate, would echo in my memory for years. Because in that moment, I realized wealth wasn't just in currency. It was in comfort, in status, in the stories we tell to excuse indifference. And like fog on a mirror, that comfort can obscure everything human from view. At the private terminal, everything moved with quiet efficiency. The kind of luxury that doesn't need to show off because it assumes you've already seen it all. Uniformed attendants took our bags, a stewardess greeted us by name, and the jet waited on the tarmac like a promise of escape. But before we boarded, my grandfather paused at the base of the stairs. He took a deep breath, the kind that feels heavier than lungs can carry, and looked back at the city, not at its beauty, but at its burden. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. "Paris was once my cathedral," he said, "but last night reminded me, even cathedrals cast shadows." Then he climbed the steps without looking back. Once on board, he sank into the leather seat and opened a folder of documents. Just like that, the mask returned. The tycoon, the strategist, the legend. But I knew better now. I had seen the man behind the posture. The boy who had watched his mother beg. The stranger who had fed a forgotten child. And most importantly, the soul that hadn't entirely given up on grace. I didn't say anything. I just sat across from him, watching the city shrink beneath us as the jet lifted into the clouds. Somewhere down there, Elise was walking a different path because of what he had done. And somewhere in the space between altitude and memory, a lesson carved itself into my heart like a scar that would never fade. The flight home stretched out like a silent confession neither of us knew how to finish. My grandfather spent most of it reading contracts, underlining figures with the same cold precision he once used to cut business rivals out of multi-million-dollar deals. But I could tell his mind wasn't entirely on the ink. Every now and then, he would pause, pen in midair, eyes drifting toward the clouds outside, as if some invisible hand had reached in and touched the ache he didn't know how to name. I sat across from him, pretending to sleep, though I was wide awake. My thoughts spun in endless circles. Elise's tiny frame curled around that plate, the way her eyes burned with hunger but not shame. The envelope tucked into her coat like a secret. I wondered if she had opened it yet. If she had run. If she had cried. And I wondered too how many Elise I had ignored before that night. When we landed, everything looked painfully ordinary. The car was waiting. The driver bowed. The sun was shining in that artificial way cities always fake. But something in the air felt off. We rode in silence back to his estate. A mansion so large it had wings he hadn't stepped in for years. The gates opened automatically. The fountain still poured wine-colored water in the center of the courtyard, and the staff lined up at the entrance like a royal procession. It all seemed ridiculous now. Opulence built not for living, but for display. We stepped inside, and I noticed something subtle. The paintings on the wall, once proud and stoic, seemed to glare now, almost as if they knew what we had done and didn't approve. It was as if the house itself resented the moment of humility that had dared to sneak into its marble halls. That night, over dinner, I asked him the question I'd been too afraid to voice. "Will you ever see her again?" He didn't answer right away. He cut into his lamb, chewed slowly, sipped his wine. Then he said, "Maybe not, but that's not the point." I leaned forward, confused. "Then what is?" He set down his fork, wiped his lips, and looked me dead in the eyes. "Some acts of grace aren't meant to be followed up. They're meant to be given. Period. No reward, no recognition, just given." I felt something heavy settle in my chest. He wasn't being noble. He wasn't even being sentimental. He was being real. For perhaps the first time since I'd known him. And that terrified me more than any speech about wealth or power ever had. Later that evening, I walked past his study and saw the door cracked open. Inside, the light was dim, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. He sat at his desk, staring, at a blank sheet of paper. Not reading, not writing, just staring. I watched him for a while, unnoticed. The man who had conquered markets, who had built empires with nothing but will and calculation, now looked small, not defeated, but still, as if something in him had been shaken loose, and he didn't know whether to mourn it or nurture it. I backed away quietly, leaving him alone in the quiet of his reckoning. Because maybe, just maybe, he wasn't thinking about Elise anymore. Maybe he was thinking about the version of himself he had abandoned decades ago, and whether, by feeding one little girl, he had finally forgiven that forgotten boy. The days that followed passed like a slow exhale. The mansion returned to its rhythm. Business calls at sunrise, staff moving like clockwork, meetings with people who bowed too low and spoke too carefully. But something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was real. My grandfather no longer barked orders across the marble floors. He walked a little slower, paused a little longer before answering questions, and began reading books he once dismissed as sentimental nonsense. One afternoon, I found a copy of Les Miserables on his desk, open to a chapter about mercy and justice. He hadn't touched fiction in years. "Why this?" I asked, genuinely curious. He looked up, eyes tired but alert. "Because I want to understand what happens after the bread is given, after the child walks away. What becomes of the giver?" That question haunted me, because it suggested something deeper, that his act of kindness toward Elise wasn't closure. It was a wound that stayed open, a necessary one. And maybe that's the price of compassion. It doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings perspective, and perspective is heavy. It asks you to carry stories that don't belong to you and remember faces you might never see again. But still, it's worth it. Because once you've seen real need, real hunger, you can't unsee it, not without losing something vital in yourself. One morning, I woke to find my grandfather already waiting at the breakfast table, dressed in a modest navy sweater instead of his usual blazer. No gold watch, no silk tie, just him, stripped down to something more human. He slid an envelope across the table toward me. "I need you to take a trip for me," he said. I opened it. Inside was a letter and a photo. The photo was old, sepia-toned, a woman standing outside a bakery with a child clinging to her coat. "That's your great-grandmother," he said quietly. "And that's me." I blinked, stunned. Where was this? The outskirts of Lyon, he said. "We lived behind that bakery, slept on flour sacks, stole crusts when no one was looking." He stared at the photo like it held a secret he had only recently remembered. "I want you to go there, find the place, leave something behind." I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. Some acts of remembrance don't need explanation, only intention. I took the envelope, nodded, and said, "I will." He placed his hand on mine. A rare gesture of affection from a man who had built walls thicker than his bank vaults. "Don't do it for me," he said. "Do it for her, and do it for Elise, because this world doesn't change through speeches. It changes when boys become men who refuse to forget." That moment hit me like a thunderclap, because for all his power, all his wealth, all his control, my grandfather had finally said what I never expected him to say. He believed in redemption, not the kind you buy, but the kind you earn by seeing someone you could have ignored and choosing not to. A week later, I boarded a train bound for Lyon, the letter tucked safely in my coat pocket. The countryside blurred past the window. Sleepy hills, stone cottages, endless fields lit by a soft morning haze. I had never traveled alone before, at least not with purpose this intimate. This wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. A way to retrace the fading footprints of the man I thought I knew, and perhaps in doing so, find the missing pieces of myself. The photo stayed in my hand the entire journey. I studied every detail, the way my great-grandmother held her, sun clothes, the cracked wooden sign above the bakery, the cobblestones worn smooth by footsteps of a life they had barely survived. And though the picture didn't move, I swore I could feel it breathing, as if time had stored a memory inside its paper fibers, waiting for someone to return and let it exhale. Lion was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in tone. The streets were narrower, the people busier, and the past seemed buried beneath layers of construction and glass-fronted cafes. Still, I walked, for hours, asking, searching, showing the photo to anyone who would pause long enough to look. Most shrugged. Some smiled politely and shook their heads. But one old man, seated on a stool outside a bookshop, squinted at the image and said, "Rue de Boulanger, or what's left of it." He pointed me toward a quiet alley tucked behind, a row of new apartments. I thanked him and followed the path until I found it. The faint outline of a bakery door now sealed with bricks, the scent of flour long since replaced by concrete and rust. But it was there. It had existed, and so had they. I stood in front of that sealed door for a long time, the way one might stand at a grave, not to mourn, but to honor. I took out the letter my grandfather had written, sealed in thick parchment, unaddressed, and placed it at the base of the wall. Then, from my pocket, I pulled out a folded napkin from La Maison de l'Or, the same one Elise had used. He had saved it, pressed it flat, cleaned it, wrapped it like treasure, and now I understood why. He wasn't just remembering his past. He was connecting it to his present, to her, to me. I placed the napkin beside the letter, under a stone, and whispered the only words that came to mind. "Merci. Pour tout." Then I turned and walked away, not because I was finished, but because I had begun. On the train ride back, I didn't sleep. I stared out the window, letting the rhythm of the tracks stitch new meaning into the days that had come before. I wasn't returning to the same life. I was carrying a legacy, not of wealth or reputation, but of awareness, of what it means to see someone, to truly see. And I knew deep down that the boy in that photo, barefoot and forgotten, had waited his whole life for someone to return, to tell him, "You mattered, you were seen, you were not lost." And if I could give that message to him, then maybe, someday, I could give it to someone else. When I returned to the estate, the sky was already dark, and the lights inside glowed with a kind of warmth that hadn't existed before. Not because the bulbs were any different, but because I was. I stepped inside quietly, unsure of whether my grandfather was awake. I found him in the garden, seated beneath the stone pergola, a wool blanket draped over his legs, and a book resting closed on his lap. He looked up as I approached, and for the first time he didn't greet me with a question, a command, or a lesson. He simply nodded, as if he already knew what I had done, as if he had been waiting for the echo. I sat beside him, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The garden was silent, but alive. Wind brushing through the ivy, leaves rustling like old stories turning their last page. Eventually, I broke the silence. "I found it," I said. "The bakery, or what's left of it." He didn't react, didn't flinch, just let the words land. "Good," he said softly. "And did you leave it behind?" I nodded. "Yes." "The letter, the napkin." He smiled faintly, as if something inside him had finally been returned. "Then you understand," he said. "It's not about saving people. It's about not letting the world forget them." That line sank deep into me, not like a fact, but like a truth you feel in your bones long before your mind can name it. He wasn't just talking about Elise. He was talking about every person we step over, every face we blur into the background, every soul we reduce to a situation instead of a story. He turned his head and looked me full in the eyes. "You will inherit everything I've built," he said, "but that doesn't make you wealthy. Wealth is what you carry here." He tapped his chest. "When no one is watching, when there's no applause, when the only person who knows what you did is you." His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw tears glisten behind his stoic mask, not falling, just present, alive, like ghosts refusing to be buried. "I built empires, boy. But I never built peace. That girl, she gave me a moment of it. And you brought it home. I didn't know what to say. I reached into my coat and pulled out the photograph, the one of him and his mother, and placed it in his hands. He looked at it for a long time, and then, without a word, slipped it into his chest pocket, over his heart. "Thank you," he said, not like a man speaking to a grandson, but like a man speaking to the only person who truly knew what he had carried all these years. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the night breeze carry the rest of the conversation away. I sat beside him in silence, realizing that sometimes the most sacred things between two people are never spoken, only felt. The days that followed were quiet, not the kind of quiet that weighs heavy with absence, but the kind that feels sacred, earned. My grandfather no longer filled his calendar with meetings or calls. Instead, he took long walks through the estate gardens, reread old letters, and spent hours by the window, watching the trees shift in the wind as if searching for something only he could recognize. And in that stillness, something began to unfold between us. Not through grand conversations or dramatic gestures, but through presence. He would invite me to sit with him, sometimes in the study, sometimes under the sycamore tree where he once carved his initials as a boy. And we would simply be. No lectures, no performances, just two men, decades apart, bound by a night in Paris that neither of us could, or wanted to, forget. One afternoon, as I was organizing books in the library, I stumbled upon a locked drawer in his old writing desk. It wasn't marked, and I'd never seen him open it. Curiosity nudged me, and when I asked him about it later, he didn't hesitate. He handed me a small brass key and said, "If you're going to carry the weight of my name, you should know what it holds." I opened it that evening. Inside were journals, dozens of them, worn, leather-bound, filled with scribbled thoughts, names, dates, regrets. He had documented everything, not his wealth, not his triumphs, but the people he had failed to help. Their names were listed carefully, often with the phrase, "I should have done more." I read in stunned silence, page after page, as the myth of the untouchable patriarch gave way to the truth of a man who had spent his entire life building, only to realize too late what he had left undone. Among the pages, I found one dated decades earlier. It read, "A girl outside a train station, rain in her hair. I gave her nothing. I told myself I couldn't help everyone, but I think I was afraid of starting with one." That single entry gutted me, because now I understood. Elise wasn't an anomaly. She was redemption. A chance to rewrite a line he had never forgiven himself for. And I was the witness, the carrier of that rewritten story. I closed the journal slowly, hands trembling, and returned it to the drawer. But that entry, it stayed with me. It lives with me still. That night, as we sat in the study and listened to the crackling fireplace, I asked him the question I had been afraid to say out loud. "Do you think she'll remember you?" He looked into the fire, then at me. "I hope not," he said. "I don't need to be remembered. I just hope she remembers that someone saw her. That just once someone didn't walk away." I swallowed hard. "But you changed her life." He shook his head slowly. "No, she changed mine. I just gave her dinner. She gave me back my soul." Winter came slowly that year, creeping into the corners of the estate like an old friend that no one invited but everyone expected. The days grew shorter, the nights quieter, and though the fire still burned in the hearth and the walls still held their warmth, something in the air felt final, like a chapter nearing its last page. My grandfather's health had been steady, but that season brought with it a frailty I hadn't seen before. His hands, once steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, now trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his books. But he never complained, never admitted fatigue, only spoke more softly, moved more slowly, as if life, for the first time, was asking him to listen rather than lead. One morning, I found him seated on the garden bench, wrapped in a heavy coat, staring at the bare trees like they were telling him something no one else could hear. "They survive without applause," he said when I joined him. "They let go of what they no longer need, and they wait." I nodded, unsure if he was speaking about the trees or himself. "Do you regret anything?" I asked, breaking the stillness. He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat and pulled out the photo, the one of him and his mother. It was worn now, creased from being held too many times. Only that it took me so long to realize wealth means nothing if it isn't shared when it matters most. He turned to me, and his gaze was sharp, even through the weariness. "Promise me something," he said. "When your time comes, when you're seated in the same kind of restaurant, faced with the same kind of choice, don't hesitate. Don't rationalize. Don't tell yourself it's not your problem. Just open the door." I promised, not because it was the polite thing to say, but because I meant it. Because that night in Paris had carved itself into me like scripture, and I knew I would never unlearn what I had seen, the way a single act of grace could ripple through lifetimes. As we sat there in silence, a small envelope fell from his coat pocket. I picked it up, confused. "What's this?" I asked. He smiled. "A letter, for her." My chest tightened. "For Elise?" He nodded. "In case you ever find her again, or if she ever finds you." I held the envelope carefully, like it was more fragile than paper, because it was. It carried a piece of him, a thread from a tapestry only the two of them had begun to weave that night. I didn't open it. I didn't ask what it said. Some words aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be delivered, whole, unbroken, and in faith. The wind rustled the trees above us, and I knew then that time was folding in, that the moment we were sharing might be one of the last. Not because anything tragic had happened, but because grace, like seasons, always prepares the heart before the farewell. And my grandfather, this giant of a man who once ruled boardrooms in cities, was now preparing to let go with the same quiet dignity he had given to that little girl, without fanfare, without drama, just enough love to last beyond the moment. It was early spring when he passed, peacefully, in his sleep. No final speech, no dramatic ending, just the slow exhale of a man who had, for once, made peace with his own story. The estate fell into stillness. Staff whispered in hallways. Old business partners sent flowers, statements, and condolences crafted by assistants. The world remembered him as the man who built empires, negotiated with kings, and walked through global markets with the confidence of a man who could not be touched. But I remembered him differently. I remembered the quiet strength of his hand on a child's shoulder, the way his voice trembled when he said her name, and the night he broke every rule he had ever lived by, just to make space at his table for someone who had nothing left to give. The funeral was small, by his request. No opulent display, no grand tributes, just a few close friends, a handful of staff, and me. As we lowered him into the earth, I reached into my coat and pulled out the letter he had written, the one for Elise. I had carried it every day since that conversation in the garden, unsure if I'd ever find her, unsure if it would ever be delivered. But now it was clear. It didn't need to reach her hands. It had already reached her heart. Through that meal, through that moment, through that silent promise passed between two souls from opposite worlds. I tucked the letter into his breast pocket beneath the photo of his mother and whispered, "She saw you, and so did I." Months passed. I returned to Paris, not for business, not for luxury, but because something inside me refused to let the thread fray. I walked the same streets, visited the same restaurant, which now had a plaque by the window. On this spot, a stranger once fed hope to a hungry soul. I don't know who placed it there. I didn't ask. I simply stood in front of it and let the memory rush in like wind through open doors. And then I saw her, across the street, taller now. Her clothes were clean, her hair tied neatly behind her shoulders, her steps calm and steady. She was carrying books, thick ones. Law, maybe. literature. She walked like someone who belonged. I didn't call out to her. I didn't interrupt. I just watched as she paused at the corner, looked up at the plaque, smiled faintly, and kept walking. That was enough. I turned and walked away, the city blooming around me in soft pastels and gold light. My grandfather had once said that wealth wasn't what you left behind, but what you passed forward, and now I understood. His fortune didn't live in vaults or estates. It lived in her, in me. In every quiet moment when someone chooses to see, to stop, to extend a hand instead of turning their back. This story is not about a rich man rescuing a poor girl. It's about a broken man finding redemption in the most unexpected place, and a child showing him that the greatest power isn't control, but compassion. And maybe, if you're listening closely, it's about you too, because someday, somewhere, someone will stand outside your window, starving not just for food, but for dignity. And in that moment, you'll have a choice: close the curtain or open the door.